Patrick, how are you today?
I'm well. How are you?
I am good. I am extra excited because this is actually our 100th episode of the podcast.
Wow,
which I think
congratulations.
is crazy. And it's wild that I exist on the internet 100 different times.
I feel the same way.
But that's super exciting. So I think, it's a good day to be recording a podcast at 8:04 a.m.
Yeah,
but
well done.
Heck yeah. Okay. Welcome back to the Commerce Collective, a podcast brought to you by Flywheel. You're listening to This Month Above the Fold, a monthly series on the Commerce Collective feed where Patrick Miller, co-founder of Flywheel, covers the most important e-commerce stories or innovations each month, and this is your August 2024 recap. I'm Emma Irwin, brand marketing manager at Flywheel and host of this podcast. Let's get right into it. Today, we are going to go full force on some recent M&A or some assumed future M&As that have kind of popped up in conversations this month. And if we have time for anything else, so be it. But we are going to cover Mars and Kellanova, and then a potential Uber or Instacart buyout, and then also the merging of two more Amazon aggregators. Exciting. So on the Mars and Kellanova front.
Welcome to fall. Everybody's off of their summer vacation and bankers are getting busy.
Yep, they're back to business. On the Mars and Kellanova front, so this is obviously a huge deal, both in terms of this acquisition itself and just the monetary sum involved in this, $36 billion. I would love your take on why is this happening? Is there any kind of hidden meaning here for the enterprise CPG landscape?
Well, I always find it fascinating how brands break apart and then come back together into sort of different forms. And whether it's the disposition of brands, spinoffs like what Unilever's doing with their ice cream portfolio, or what Kellogg's did in splitting the declining cereal business from the growing snacks business. And so talking about here is the snacks business, which has been, sort of a growth vehicle, being Mars coming in, privately held Mars, and purchasing it. And so to me, one, it's interesting of sort of this calculation of, when is a stock trading at a discount because of some of the parts. And then so, if I go back to, Kellogg's, it was trading at a discount because of the declining cereal business. They announced the original breakup, the stock goes up 4%. And then if we then look at, what's happening right now, the stock is up, I want to say it was up 25% at the announcement, or roughly around that. But Mars is offering a 33%, premium to where the stock was trading, which shows that then the market has a little bit of a discount as to, what are the chances of this thing going through. And then you say okay, well, why does Mars think it will work across their businesses and that they create operating leverage and, and sort of efficiencies, versus why did it not work when it was the Goliath that was Kellogg's? And I think that's an interesting question. So it's why do snacks and cereals not work, but snacks and confection and chocolate might work? And to me, I look at sort of what, Hershey's has done historically in acquiring, some, snacks businesses and getting into that space and getting into other sort of adjacent things to candy. And it has proven to work well for Hershey's. And I think Mars is seeing that success and saying, hey, we're going to go after that as well. So anyway, I think it's sort of a fascinating move, and, and overall will be interesting to see sort of if it closes.
I was reading somewhere, I think it was a Grocery Dive article, and it was kind of talking about maybe this is signaling that there's weaknesses in Mars confectionery or candy. I don't know if they said chocolate specifically, but somewhere in that business, and this compensates for that. But I was also kind of that doesn't really make sense because it's snacks coming into candy. But I am curious, in your mind, why does candy and snacks work better than cereal and snacks? I'm trying to wrap my head around this. I don't understand.
I think a lot of it's, impulsivity is a huge one. And so sort of some folks are, impulsive around chocolate, some sugar, some salty. And so there are similar ways of thinking through sort of merchandising and advertising. I also think it's interesting of sort of it's the, these are all high household penetration categories. And so are there learnings, around advertising and promotional strategy around sort of mass reach? And then also just they're all growth categories, as opposed to the cereal business, which is declining. And maybe folks can somehow figure out how to turn that thing around. But I sort of see that as sort of a macro challenge, especially around, sort of sugar, processed foods, and, hey, I want to eat a healthier breakfast. So I think it's going to be tough sledding for the cereal business.
Got it. Got it. Got to say, I'm not a cereal fan. I got asked the question the other day, what's your favorite cereal? And I was like, I'm not really any of them. They are all
No,
just
they're
like
sugar
sugar.
bombs. Like
Yeah,
I'm
they're
all for
awful.
sugar. Like I love sugar, but like it's like I don't want it at 6 o'clock in the morning. So yeah, same. Yeah, we've moved to oatmeal and and eggs.
Yep, yep. That's probably better in the long run. My last question on this topic is, should PepsiCo and like the Mondeleses of the world be worried here? Or do you think, they're good?
But think about PepsiCo, what they did years and years ago. They were actually earlier here and they said, hey, we're going to buy, Frito and Pepsi. And to me, that's actually a really interesting supply chain story, because what are the things that they put together? The high cube and the heavy stuff. And so this is taking advantage, of Pepsi's, ability to deliver, that last mile to create a company, and also a company that relies on face outs. And so if I'm Pepsi and you need to make sure that you have the face outs there for both snacks and the beverage, well, now you can be combined into one truck and one person. And so there's, sort of operating leverage there. So yeah, so I would look at them, but then I even go back, okay, what is Mondelez? Well, Mondelez is really Keebler and sort of the, the spin out there. And so, I think this is also part of like the, just the various corporate life cycles and what are the core theses and how do brands bounce around? And I think anybody in this industry, it's like, it's interesting to see that like Pringles used to be a part of P&G, and it's, and watching it sort of, I used to work on it a long time ago when it's part of P&G. And so it's a, sort of seeing these brands bounce around. Who are their corporate owners? Why are people investing in them? Why are they not? And, and how do we then learn from it from a macro perspective, and then then ultimately an operational perspective.
Got it. Got it. All right. Moving us along, we are pivoting slightly to Uber and Instacart. So the information put out a story, and I doubt they were the first person to ever hypothesize Uber potentially acquiring Instacart. But they did put out this story, and it's kind of mentioned, Instacart hasn't been received super well by the street after going public. There's a quote in there that it's just a slog, things are tough, etc. So I think like this partnership has seemed like a win-win for some time, but do you think this acquisition is really going to come to fruition?
Well, okay, first off, I think it's fascinating that the information gets so many scoops on Instacart. And so to me, conspiracy theory in my mind is, and if you just look over the last couple of years and within the information and how frequently they get detailed financials from Instacart or, sort of a strategy docs or whatever. So to me, like I start with the question of, did Instacart plant, this story and, so that people would be talking about it? And if so, why? So to me, it's like, I've just seen too many stories on, from the information about Instacart that's detailed that tells me that like, there's a decent chance that they wanted this story published. And so, okay, well, why would they want to do that? Well, then that says, well, because they're saying to Uber, put a ring on it. And, they're putting a little bit of pressure, on Uber would be my guess. And so it's like, so then it's the question. I'm like, okay, well, why are they doing that? We make those assumptions. Or we can just say, why could they? You're totally wrong there. Since Instacart's IPO, they're up like 19-ish percent, 20%, somewhere around there, which is a third of where DoorDash and Uber are versus the same timeline. Total enterprise value of Instacart's about $9 billion, which is down from their 39 or so billion when they were a privately held company. And so to your point, like, yeah, it's a slog. It's not easy. They've made steady progress, as a publicly traded company, but they're subscale compared to some of their competitors, and they're looking at ways to combine forces here, which to me is sort of like ultimately is a question of sort of network efficiency. If you like the drivers, the gig workers, you want them running as high as efficiency as possible. That's good for them. They make more money. It's good for you. It decreases your cost to serve. And so going back to sort of the original thesis of why did these folks all get into these adjacent categories, it's avoid a fallow asset, which is, i.e. the gig worker. And so here, if you did combine them, you're doing restaurants, you're doing groceries. So, they want to avoid the fallow asset. You want to, they want to be delivering groceries. They want to be delivering restaurant meals. They want to be delivering people to where they want to go. And in that sense, this makes a lot of sense. The partnership makes a lot of sense. And it becomes sort of like a one app, for things that are delivered via the gig economy.
Do you think if this were to really come to life, like, what does this mean for DoorDash? And then additionally, like, I'm kind of thinking, I always, in my mind, like Instacart gets compared to Walmart and Target just because it is a method of acquiring groceries in some capacity. And like, what would it mean, again, with competition against those two retailers? So on the flip side, like the very delivery focused versus grocer?
I like to look at it in the concept of, what's happening on the macro level. And so if we go back, when these things all took off, they take off during COVID because people don't want to go into a grocery store. They're worried about their health. They boom, and then they post COVID, people start to pull back. They decide, hey, I like shopping in, Wegmans or wherever. And then you then have a cohort of folks, that are either driven by convenience. You tend to be more affluent, that rely on these apps, for delivery, whether that is for restaurants or for groceries. And so my guess is what they're seeing is like, again, getting back to the gig workers, because Instacart very much sees them as a customer as well, which I think is smart. If customers are more pinched and they then pull back on their tipping, it's like, how do you help the gig workers make more money? And so by offering them the ability to deliver, more things to more people in a concentrated area, that ultimately I feel like is good for everybody. Comparing to Target and Walmart and Instacart have a great partnership. And you can see when you go on the Instacart app, you can get Walmart items at, same as in-store prices. And then when Walmart reports to the streets, one of their great achievements recently is their ability to pull in more affluent customers. Well, who has a whole bunch of affluent customers? Instacart. And so you then use, sort of one to help the other and vice versa. And so I think it's a great partnership to get the price and selection of Walmart over to Instacart customers and continue to drive both of those businesses. Versus DoorDash, in a little bit lesser so, Grubhub, they're trying to get into the adjacent categories, but it's easier for Uber/Instacart to expand more and more into restaurants than it is for DoorDash, Grubhub to expand into people. And so like it makes a lot of sense to me. But then I would then think of like, okay, well, what does then Lyft do? And so we would expect some sort of partnership over there because there can only be so many of these things. And we got too many right now, it appears.
All right. Moving on to our last one. This is more Amazon aggregators are feeling the heat here. They're trying to make something happen by merging together, these being Branded and Heyday as those two aggregators that are planning to kind of merge together. But I'm curious, what makes this one worth talking about to you? And then more in the long run, like were any Amazon aggregators actually set up for like sustainable success? It seems kind of like a no, but would love to get your thoughts.
I believe that the Amazon aggregators is like a series of like money stuff newsletters that like I can't wait for them to write about because like it's just fascinating financial engineering. And so if you go back to these things, and this is like when you hear everybody like talk about like private credit and private credit taking off, like this is the one of the expressions of that. And i.e. when the aggregators raise money, they raised some equity, but they mostly raised debt. And that is, you then because they're buying assets that, had profit and had free cash flow and whatnot. But unfortunately, the problem with raising debt is that debt sits on top of the cap table. And so they get paid back before, any of the equity holders. And so in order to then, transact here with a whole bunch of debt, you got to get a bunch of people to play nice who don't necessarily like one another. And so how do you smush together these cap tables is a fascinating question. It's not just like they can just write a check. And then it's a question of like, well, who is actually on the cap table and who's invested here? And you hear Victory Park oftentimes, but Apollo had invested like, $500 million into Victory Park. And Victory Park is one of the main lenders to these aggregators. And so it's like, I don't know if it's debt or equity that Apollo put into there, but so it's sort of like you just peel back the layers of the onions. Eventually it all comes back to big PE firms, and they want their money back. And so they're now saying, all right, like how do we, sort of engineer this thing, for success, wipe out the bad debt, create a cleaner, sort of cap structure. And then, hopefully this business is operating well. And so the thing I found most fascinating in the article is, there was a sentence in there about the path forward is looking for, so basically how do they get these brands in brick and mortar retail? And I'm just like, oh my God, it's the same hangover as like D2C brands like 7 years ago. And it's the exact same story where it's like people looked at whether it's a D2C brand or an aggregator, and they thought that Amazon or the D2C site was an existential position. It's not. It's a class of trade. And so, they're a little bit just sort of growing up and realizing like what a brand actually is and where a brand can trade, where they find customers. And retail is really important. And so, and being at more than one retailer is really important. As much as I love Amazon, as much as I love Walmart, for brands, like you have to get distribution at multiple retailers. And so this is just proving that out, and they're going to do a bunch of financial engineering to make it work. And so it'll just be, fascinating to watch this happen.
I see. Yeah. The people, they don't learn. History loves to repeat itself.
It's the exact same story as the D2C. But to your point, okay, were any of these brands set up, for success? And if you go back to sort of the original thesis, it's like, okay, aggregator borrows money, Aggregator is then going to buy brands at a whatever X EBITDA. You sum them up, and the enterprise value is a whatever X EBITDA, and that gain is what provides the return. The challenge with that thesis is Amazon has 500 million ASINs, and Walmart's got about the same SKUs, and so just because you got a basket of them doesn't mean that there's any operational efficiency there. And so to me, like as I look at these things going forward, it's like, how do you run it as an actual house of brands? I.e., if you look at various CPGs or like you look at like Stanley Black & Decker, they buy every tool business they can get their hands on, right? And so as they then do that, you create operating leverage because they're like one another. And so that gets back to marketing, that gets back to advertising, that gets back to manufacturing, and so to me, it's sort of like going forward within these aggregators, it's finding like businesses where you can create operating efficiency, as well as, top line, because you get more insights because you have more brands. Like that's one of the central thesis of AMC. The brands that benefit most from AMC are the ones that have the most glance views and the most ASINs. And because you can create network effects across your various SKUs and your various ASINs. Sort of like the same thing with aggregators. And so they need to figure out, hey, how do these brands play nice together and help one another, as opposed to just being sort of a math equation, in a finance calculation.
All right. I think that'll wrap us up for this month. That did in fact take the whole time. We love it.
I told you, like it's fun. Like fall's here. Everybody's off their summer vacation. Bankers are doing work.
I don't want to accept that summer is over.
Well, we didn't even get to talk about like the feds, and when do the feds come in here, and they're like, and what do they do? And like that is another fascinating one. And so post-election, what happens? I think there's a lot of M&A that's sort of sitting idle, waiting to see sort of what happens within the election. So it's entertaining.
Yeah, so I was going to ask, like, what are you looking forward to for September? But I'm going to guess it's more M&As and seeing what happens, and then going out past the election, what happens then?
Yeah, I mean, I think M&A market. Does the IPO market ever restart? When does it restart? Yeah, and what's the impact is like as the Fed cuts rates? What does that then mean for everyone? We're in a very different. It's like I'm obviously older than you, and I remember when like we had interest rates, and versus you've never seen them before, and so I was talking to my dad the other day, and he like still lives in the house built 40 years ago, and like when his interest rate was like 12%. And he was like, I got a deal, late 70s. and now we see them, and, folks are like, they're half that. And they're like, oh my God, this is insane. And so to me, like just what are the second order effects of the changes in interest rates, as well as federal regulations? What happens as those things change is what I'm looking forward to seeing. So interest rates going down, and then whatever happens within the federal atmosphere will be really interesting. And a de minimis provision like that. There's no way that thing lasts, but it's slowly moving through Congress. There's no way that thing lasts.
And that's it for this month's e-commerce news. Tune into next month's episode for the latest and greatest everything you need to know about the world of e-commerce. I'm Emma Irwin, and I will see you next time.